No doubt, almost all of you have seen the Hayek and Keynes rap videos, Fear the Boom and Bust, Battle of the Century. I also like to think about my book as a very handy reference companion to those videos. And the reason I suggest that is because those videos have like 3 million hits. So you can do the math. More seriously, this project began when I was teaching at the University of Missouri St. Louis. I've been at George Mason just 3 years now. And 2 weeks before the semester started, I was drafted to teach the department's course on the history of economic thought. And since I had so little time to prepare, you know, a rigorous course from Aristotle to the present, I had the desperate idea that I could sort of cobble together a course by, at each class meeting, showing an excerpt, like 7 to 10 minutes, from the PBS documentary, The Commanding Heights, the first 2 hours of which talk about the intellectual debates of the 20th century, particularly as personified by Hayek and Keynes. And showing the video segments at the start of each class would not only kill some time, it would also make Keynes and Hayek real to the students, because after all, now they're not just guys in books, they're on TV. It actually, I think, worked that way. And it would have the benefit of teaching the students some economic history, sort of putting the debate in the framework of what the big issues at the time were. And teaching economic history was not only a virtue in its own right, but it would allow me to pad my lectures with material that were in my course on economic history that I'd already taught before. And then I would spend the rest of the class going more deeply into what the Commanding Heights had glossed over in just a few minutes. And I don't know about the students, but to me it actually made the course interesting to teach, and I thought I put a lot of work into it, actually, as it turned out, by the end of the semester, and then it turned out to take even a lot more work to turn the lecture notes into a book. But in places you can still see sort of the skeleton of the Commanding Heights kind of lurking in the background. So in many respects this is a book in the history of economic thought, but I like to think it's a little more than that, or it's an atypical history of thought, because it only covers the good parts. That is, it only covers the economic theory and the empirical work that are useful for economic policy, not the esoteric, purely blackboard parts. Because it focuses on the policy issues, it's organized issue by issue. So each chapter deals with a particular area of a particular policy dispute and frames that debate with a historical event that brought these contrasting ideas to the forefront. So it's not one of these encyclopedic histories of economic thought that, as I said, start with the Aristotle or the scholastics and move in chronological order. You might call but then as necessary within each chapter to understand what people were talking about in the last 100 years, I go back to what earlier economists said as far back as Adam Smith. And so it's somewhat non-chronological within each chapter. And to defend this, in the introduction to the book, I quote Quentin Tarantino, who told an interviewer that when I made, quoting, "When I made Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction non-linear, I was not just doing it to show what a clever boy I was. Those stories were better served dramatically to be done the way I did them." And I think actually, in some ways, the most vivid way to tell the story of an intellectual debate will often involve these kinds of flashbacks. So don't think of the book's narrative as chronologically scrambled. Think of it as Tarantino-esque, only with more polite language and less bloodshed. Each chapter of the book begins with a little vignette, which is related to the events that I'm describing or the personalities in the chapter. And I want to relate some of those to you because I think it's the best hook I've got for making you want to buy the book, if you haven't bought it already. And so I've got 7.5 minutes. That works out to 30 seconds per chapter. So this will be like going to iTunes to sample a CD, right? You get 30 seconds of each track. The first chapter is entitled The Turn from Laissez-Faire, and it tries to set the stage by discussing the contrasting views of economists on the eve of the First World War, and in particular, the declining adherence to the doctrine of laissez-faire. So to introduce the two central characters, we visit Cambridge, University of Cambridge in the fall of 1905, where a clever mathematics student named John Maynard Keynes is taking his first and only course in economics from Alfred Marshall. And Keynes writes to a friend of his, "I think I'm rather good at it. It's so easy and fascinating to master the principles of these things." And then a week later he writes, "Marshall is continually pestering me to turn professional economist." Then we dramatically switch to the banks of the Piave River in northern Italy during the First World War. And there's a young lieutenant named Friedrich Hayek who has a chance to open his first economics texts during a lull in the combat. Hayek later says he's surprised that these books didn't give him a permanent distaste for economics. They were so badly written and so Germanic. But when he returned to the University of Vienna after the war, Hayek discovered the work of Karl Menger, which got him hooked on economics. In chapter two is about the Bolshevik Revolution and the socialist calculation debate. Begins with a letter written by Lenin to the Bolsheviks, or the Bavarian socialists who had just seized power in Munich and declared a Bavarian Soviet Republic. And Lenin gives them advice about how to consolidate power, but he doesn't offer them any advice about how to run the economy once the factories and the farms and the banks have all been seized. And this is Lenin's problem. He wanted to institute a Marxist economy, but Marx hadn't left any blueprint, only sort of visionary statements about abolishing private property and putting the direction of production into the hands of the collective, but not really any guidelines for what the collective is supposed to do. So, segue to the famous debate over socialist economic calculation. Chapter 3 is the Roaring Twenties in Austrian business cycle theory. It begins with the story of Irving Fisher and the stock market crash. Maybe you know this story. Fisher invented something kind of like the Rolodex, sold it, took what he got, and parlayed it into a fairly big fortune on the stock market, worth about $10 million reportedly, which is about $130-some million today. He became known as a stock market prognosticator. And on October 15th, 1929, he's at a dinner meeting as a speaker in New York City, and as reported in the New York Times, he tells the audience that stock prices had reached, quote, what looks like a permanently high plateau. 2 weeks later, of course, the market crashed. Fisher was wiped out because he had borrowed, he was putting his money where his mouth was. He had borrowed heavily to buy stocks on margin. He was so wiped out he had to sell his house and move in with his sister-in-law. He had no other place to live. Economists around the world, of course, are puzzled by the crash and try to explain it. So segue, for the purposes of this chapter, to the Mises-Hayek theory, and later I'll talk about the Keynesian theory and the monetarist theory of the Great Depression. Chapter 4, the New Deal and Institutionalist Economics, begins just with a slight bit of bias, I suppose, with Rexford Tugwell sitting in a marble-clad lobby in Rome, Italy, in October 34. Tugwell's a member of the Brain Trust and advisor to FDR, and he's in Rome to talk to Mussolini, who he admires very much, or admired his economic policies anyway. In his diary, Tugwell had written that Mussolini's regime was doing many of the things that seemed to me necessary and was the cleanest, neatest, most efficiently operating piece of social machinery I've ever seen. It makes me envious. Okay, a little bit unfair, but segue to the ideas that Tugwell got from institutionalist economics and from other writers, and how those ideas were inputs into the policies of the New Deal. Chapter 5 is the Great Depression and Keynes's general theory. So, right, 1932, the Depression had barely begun, but by the time of Keynes's general theory in 36, it was very deep. Well, it had started to recover, actually, but there was a relapse, of course, in 37, 38. The chapter begins with Keynes writing a letter to a correspondent who, as it turns out, is George Bernard Shaw, the famous playwright. Shaw was more famous as a playwright today, but at the time, he was just as well known as an amateur economist and member of the Fabian Society, and had been the author of many, many pamphlets and book chapters advocating various schemes for socializing the economy. So Keynes writes to Shaw, this is in 1935, while he's writing the General Theory, "To understand my state of mind, you have to know that I believe myself to be writing a book on economic theory which will largely revolutionize, not I suppose at once, but in the course of the next 10 years, the way the world thinks about economic problems." A bold statement, but of course it turns out to be true. And of course Keynes's influence is confirmed, famously confirmed, when Richard Nixon tells an interviewer in 1971, "I am now a Keynesian in economics." Chapter 6 is the Second World War and Hayek's road to serfdom, and this is one of my favorite stories. It begins in the spring of 1933 when two German SS agents come knocking at the door of the classical liberal German economist Wilhelm Röpke. You all know who the SS are. Röpke later recalled that these particular agents were, quote, "of thorough bruiser type." At least that's how his memoir was translated. Röpke had been giving speeches denouncing the Nazi Party. He had been declared an enemy of the people for that and fired from his teaching post at Marburg University. And in general, the Nazis had tried to replace all the anti-Nazis in the universities. But their main strategy was to go to the professors who'd been fired and say, "You can have your job back if you'll keep quiet." And Röpke refused to do that. And when the SS agents explained to him that he ought to be on their side, he rebuked them with what he called scorn and indignation. But as soon as he slammed the door on them as they left, he realized he needed to leave the country. Immediately. And he spent the rest of the war in Istanbul. Chapter 7, Post-War British Socialism and the Fabian Society, begins with Clement Attlee leading the Labour Party into victory in 1945. And the political scientist Harold Lasky, who was an important socialist theorist, actually had an office just down the hall from Hayek's. A series of newspaper stories by a paper that was hostile to the Labour Party reported favorable statements Lasky was making about the Soviet Union and even about Stalin's government. And Attlee wasn't pleased by this, and he sent Lasky a private message that read, "A period of silence on your part would be welcome." After winning the election, Lasky held a press conference at which he insisted to the reporters that he would be making policy, not Professor Lasky. And the New York Times responded to this by running a story with the headline, quote, "Britain not ruled by intellectuals." Chapter 8 is sort of the counterpart to the Fabian Society, so segue to a discussion of the Fabian Society, what their ideas were, where they got them, and how they went into the Labour Party. Chapter 8 is a kind of a counterpart. It's the Mont Pelerin Society and the rebirth of Smithian economics. In an earlier draft, the title was The Rebirth of Spontaneous Order Economics, but I was persuaded by Dan Klein to change it to Smithian. Well, by Dan and a friend of his named Joy. That's an inside Mason joke. This chapter begins in a small Swiss village above the northern shore of Lake Geneva in April '47, where another German economist, Walter Eucken, was peeling and eating an orange and really, really enjoying it. And George Stigler notes this in his recollection of the event. And why was he really, really enjoying the orange so much? Well, he'd spent the war in Germany. There were no oranges, at least if you weren't in the party elite. And Eucken was, in fact, an anti-Nazi. He had remained in Germany for the duration of the war. He was almost arrested because he was a friend of Karl Goerdeler, who was involved in the Valkyrie plot. I don't know if you saw the Tom Cruise movie. Throughout the book, I have footnotes recommending movies. And then segue to the connection between running from Adam Smith to F.A. Hayek by way of Karl Menger, and the contrast between the Mont Pelerin Society and the Fabian Society. Chapters 9 and 10 are kind of a pair. 9 is on the post-war German wonder economy, and ordo-liberalism being the ideology behind the market-friendly policies. That chapter begins, it's paired with chapter 10, which is about the very different policies adopted in India. Chapter 9 begins with a telephone ringing in the office of Ludwig Erhard, who was the director of the economic administration of the UK-US occupied buy zone, a classical liberal economist who just by happenstance got this job. At the other end of the line was the American military commander of the region, General Lucius Clay. Lucius Clay's office had gotten word that in the speech Erhard was about to give, introducing the new Deutschmark to replace the old Reichsmark, that he was going to go beyond that and announce decontrol of many prices and the end of rationing for those goods, which had not been officially cleared by the Allied authorities. So Erhard comes on the line and General Clay says to him, "Professor Erhard, my advisors tell me that you are making a big mistake." And Erhard replies, "So my advisors also tell me." At least that's the way Erhard later told the story. I'm not sure it's completely accurate, but the decontrol went ahead and Germany's economy boomed. Things went very differently in India. Chapter 10 is Indian Planning and Development Economics, but it's lately been known unofficially as Tyler Cowen's favorite chapter. It begins with Peter Bauer, the Hungarian turned English economist, development economist, visiting India for the first time in 1958. And he's looking for an Indian economist named B.R. Shenoy. He's looking for Shenoy because in 1955, when the Indian government introduces the second five-year plan, they appoint a committee of economists, a panel of 21 economists, to review the plan and offer their endorsement or suggestions. And 20 of the economists signed a statement endorsing the plan. Shenoy was the only dissenter, and he issued a dissenting note criticizing the plan, saying that market forces would do a better job allocating resources. And this note of dissent was a real annoyance to the members of the Indian Planning Commission, to the Prime Minister, Nehru, to Nehru's advisor who had drafted the plan, whose name was Mahalanobis, and to the international aid officials who were all behind this effort. But Bauer, being a critic of the plan himself, was eager to meet Shenoy. So he went to the British High Commission and asked them whether they were in any sort of contact with Shenoy. And the official he spoke to replied that, "We're too busy to have time for acknowledged madmen." That's how unwelcome Shenoy was in official circles. How much time am I running out of? Okay. Oh, at this pace I can do it. Chapter 11 is Bretton Woods and International Monetary Thought. It begins precisely at 3 p.m. on the 6th of July, 1944, when Harry Dexter White's daily press conference has a guest star, which is John Maynard Keynes. White was the head of the U.S. delegation. Keynes was the head of the British delegation. And the reporters were very eager to hear Keynes because he was still something of a economic policy rock star, you might say, world-renowned, and still intellectually vigorous, although kind of worn out. In fact, a few days later, he had a heart attack. Keynes, of course, was not a friend of the gold standard, and he had written in 1924 that the gold standard is already a barbarous relic. At the Bretton Woods press conference, Keynes likened the gold standard to a dictator. He said the gold standard should not continue to exercise what he called tyrannical powers over the world. Instead, the work of the conference was to limit gold to the role of, quote, a monarch subject to constitutional limitations. And this way of putting it was kind of odd to those economists on the other side who viewed the gold standard itself as a useful constitutional constraint on government monetary and fiscal policies. So segue to the economists' understanding of the gold standard and their criticisms of it over the years. After Bretton Woods breaks down, or simultaneous with the breakdown of Bretton Woods, inflation picks up in the U.S. So chapter 12 is the great inflation and monetarism, because monetarism comes to the forefront as a way of explaining the inflation. The chapter begins with Milton Friedman writing a column in Newsweek applauding the appointment of Arthur Burns to head the central bank, the Federal Reserve System. Friedman had studied with Burns, so he was Burns was something of a mentor to him. And Friedman in his column urges Burns to control money growth in order to avoid inflation. But as Fed chairman, Burns very quickly begins to blame inflation on everything other than monetary policy, to cost push factors. He talks about how the economy is not working the way it's supposed to because inflation's going up at the same time that unemployment's going up. So just 3 months after he writes this Newsweek column, Friedman, although he's a friend of Burns, writes him a very stern letter criticizing his arguments, criticizing his policy proposals, and by all accounts, the two were never very good friends after that. Segue to a description of the great inflation and the monetarist explanation of it. Chapter 13 tries to cover the growth of government, public goods, and public choice as public goods and public choice being alternative explanations for why government has grown. Right? Public goods theory tells us there's a demand for government and by the public who get the benefits of government. Public choice theory tells us there's a demand from people who are not the general public who get the benefit. But the chapter begins with the famous dinner party at which Ronald Coase is defending his article about the FCC to a group of Chicago economists. Even though the article's already been published in the Journal of Law and Economics, Friedman and Stigler and others are not buying what later became known as the Coase theorem. And this dinner, Coase knew this, and this dinner was to give him a chance to defend his view against everybody else. The way Stigler later recalls the event is that, quote, "We strongly objected to this heresy," the Coase theorem. Milton Friedman did most of the talking as usual. He also did much of the thinking as usual. In the course of 2 hours of argument, the vote went from 20 against and 1 for Coase, that being Coase himself, to 21 for Coase. What an exhilarating event. I lamented afterward that we had not the clairvoyance to tape it. Coase's recollection was pretty similar. He knew that he was going to survive when he said, if Milton Friedman can't knock you out after a couple of rounds, you're home. Afterward, Aaron Director asked Coase to write up the arguments he had just made. The result was an article called The Theory of the Problem of Social Cost. Went on to become probably the single most cited article in economics. Segue to the public goods problem and its use as a rationale for the growth of government and the critique offered by Public Choice School. Chapter 14 is free trade, protectionism, and trade deficits, where I borrow shamelessly from Doug Irwin's work. Begins with Milton Friedman testifying before the U.S. Trade Deficit Review Commission in 1999, and he's wearing an Adam Smith necktie. And one of the commissioners says, "Oh, I see you're wearing an Adam Smith necktie." They have a little exchange. He says, "So how do you think Adam Smith would have felt about the WTO, the World Trade Organization?" And Friedman replies, "Well, in my opinion, the best policy we can follow is to unilaterally remove our restrictions on trade." And this unilaterally part is something that has always been controversial and certainly hard for politicians to grasp. So segue to the case that Adam Smith made for that proposition, and the case made for it and against it by later economists. The case against it, most importantly, being the infant industry argument. And finally, chapter 15 brings us up to the present under the title, From Pleasant Deficit Spending to Unpleasant Sovereign Debt Crisis. So it talks about Keynesian fiscal theory, or so-called Keynesian fiscal theory. We were just talking before the event about to what extent it was Keynesian. But the anecdote I begin with is one I was actually present at the Cato Monetary Conference 2 years ago. George Tavlis from the Bank of Greece, note Greece, gets up to speak, and he says to this American audience, "Well, it's a pleasure to be in the United States again, which more than ever feels like being at home." Well, You responded a lot more quickly than the audience at the time. You can go back and watch the videotape, and there's kind of some nervous titters. And Tavlis makes it clear what he means, that the U.S. fiscal deficits remind him of Greece. So the chapter goes on to discuss fiscal Keynesianism, the idea that deficit spending, unless you're at full employment, is a free lunch, or better than a free lunch, if the multiplier is more than one. Buchanan and Wagner's critique of that, the argument that deficits do burden future generations, the idea of Ricardian equivalence, and the idea of unpleasant monetarist arithmetic, which helps to explain, I think, the fix that Greece and other Eurozone countries are in. So thank you for your patience as I tried to cover all that. There's more in the book, believe me, more details and footnotes, but thanks very much.
All right, so first to comment on the book will be Doug Irwin. Professor Irwin is the Robert Maxwell Professor of Arts and Sciences in the Department of Economics at Dartmouth College. He is the author of Trade Policy Disasters, Lessons from the 1930s, which is just out this year from MIT Press. Peddling Protectionism, Smoot-Hawley and the Great Depression by Princeton University Press, which was just out last year. And then he has several other books, but one of my favorites is an older book of his called Against the Tide, An Intellectual History of Free Trade, in which he goes through and examines all the criticisms of free trade over the years, or the history of this doctrine, and shows how in that clash of ideas the essential argument for free trade still holds. So please welcome Doug Irwin.
Well, I first learned that Larry was working on this book when Tyler Cowen on Marginal Revolution said there are a bunch of working papers, chapters posted on the Mercatus website. If they look interesting, go click on the link. So I did, of course, downloaded the papers, printed them out, read them, and of course, they were just great fun. As Larry's pointed out in his remarks, they always start out with an interesting vignette, one of these stories that most economists know, but really should be widely shared, widely known. Ludwig Erhard, getting rid of price controls. The famous Coast Dinner at the University of Chicago. These are just great vignettes that are a lot of fun, but also very powerful and have a lot to tell us. So in reading this, I actually got a student group together. We read the chapters. We had Larry up to talk about them. But I just recognized immediately that this is a new, interesting way of presenting the history of economic ideas. What could be more exciting than a clash, a debate of over really big issues, that major personalities contending over very fundamental issues in economics. This is what excites students. This is what I think excites a lot of economists too. It just shows us that, first of all, we're not just rehashing old debates. These debates are still going on today, but there are very smart people in the past going over them. We can learn from them and say, what can we take away from some of these debates? They're relevant today, and I think Larry really brings that out time and time again. In addition to the good stories, these are sort of fundamental things. Now, when you contrast this with the usual way of teaching the history of economic thought, it's very chronological. You do Smith, and then you do Ricardo, Malthus, and then you do Mill, and then you do Marx, and then Marshall and Keynes. And, students sort of wonder, well, what, I took Ec 1. Do I really need to go over Marshall again? Was that really interesting stuff? So I think the debate and the clash of ideas is a great way of hooking the students, getting people really interested. The one theme that is sort of throughout every chapter and sort of is the animating part of what the debate is what is the role of government in the economy? That's sort of central. It could be issues international trade or healthcare or fiscal policy or managing markets themselves, but that's sort of what it sort of ties every chapter together. What is the purpose and role of government in public policy? And this, of course, is an eternal question. Every generation has to answer that for itself. There's always going to be contending parties over it, so it's very interesting to see how this has worked out in the past. Larry, I don't think he mentioned this in his remarks, but when I read the chapters, see the vignettes, I do see a movie version of this. It reminded me of The Commanding Heights. That's the old PBS documentary and book, which I very much enjoyed. I often show students at least the first hour or so of that, because it is the clash of ideas, and it really brings it alive for students. So this is an updated version of The Commanding Heights, if you will. So let me congratulate Larry on what I think is a great achievement. This is a big success in the sense that it interweaves an interesting and sophisticated discussion of leading economic debates. It talks about the interplay of ideas. There's also a lot of economic history involved in this as well. One of my comments will be that not quite enough, I think, but I think it's just a very nice, refreshing book that is very interesting for not just students of economics, but a wider audience as well. So if I'm just here to praise Larry, that might be, he might appreciate that, but of course I have to come up with a few criticisms. I'll have three. I'm not sure they're actually criticisms. I think they're more comments or different views, something he should consider for the second edition, than one major or big comment. So the first sort of minor comment is the first chapter. So it starts right out with the end of laissez-faire, or the turn from laissez-faire at the turn of the century. Now, in some sense, the book is a 20th century history that occasionally looks back. I just offer this out to Larry as a different place to start. It seems to me that Smith is the place to start. Smith was engaged in the first great debate, if you will, about mercantilism and trade policy. So much of the book hinges on what we think of Smith's ideas about markets, order, and things of that sort, that it's so central, I think, that it maybe should be put up front. The turn from laissez-faire, well, was laissez-faire ever a policy presumption? Smith wasn't quite there, but people could interpret him in that way. So if you start with Smith as sort of a benchmark, you can go into some of the debates later from that, I would think. So, where Smith is now, he's sort of halfway in the book, halfway through a chapter on the Mont Pelerin Society. And I think that's just demoting him too much. He deserves a little bit more front and center. Something to consider. The second thing I'd suggest is maybe even have a little bit more economic history, because the economists who were debating weren't just sort of debating ethereal ideas out in one's heads. They're debating live issues, controversies about actual policies that were going on at the time. And so, for example, when I read the chapter on India, which I think is a really great chapter and just talks about the intellectual climate in India and how it's changed, what's almost missing from that chapter is what happened in 1991 when the big policy change took place. Well, why did that policy change take place? What was the role of intellectuals? Was it just an accident because they had a crisis so they had to change course? What was the view of intellectuals after they made that change? That's a huge policy change for a country of over 1 billion people. It's have major ramifications for the world economy, and yet I think the chapter sort of petered out and really didn't talk about why that change took place and what was the role of ideas. Another chapter that could, there's no chapter on China. Once again, a big policy change. I'm not sure, maybe there's a clash of ideas there, but once again, why did this big policy change take place? Were economists, and was there a debate? Or is it just sort of an accident of history? You get a new leader, he changes course, and that's that. Another place where I think there could be a little bit more history, or maybe bringing history up to date, is the chapter on the international monetary system in Bretton Woods. There's a huge debate among economists in the 50s and 60s about the merits of flexible versus floating exchange rates. Fixed versus floating exchange rates. And once again, Milton Friedman was a major contender in that debate, and he got a lot of resistance, not only from officials in Washington around the world, but also a lot of economists. So that debate on fixed versus floating exchange rates, it's a perennial debate. We're still having it. Many developing countries are having it today. It would be fun to see a little bit of that in this book as well. And finally, the third sort of minor comment is that there's no concluding chapter. The book just ends, and I think it would have been nice to have some sort of summation about, well, what do we learn from these debates? What can we take away from these debates? What does it mean for the future? Once again, it just sort of ends abruptly, and some sort of transition I think would have been useful. And I would note that's actually true for some of the chapters too. They just end without sort of a summation saying, well, what do we take away from this debate? What can we learn? What can we conclude from it? And maybe this leads me to my last sort of larger point, which is once again more of a comment and something I think that I wish Larry had explored and I think deserves to be explored. And that's, what is the role of economic ideas in shaping the political debate and the economic policy debate and in affecting policy outcomes? In other words, we have a great rendition of all these debates. Are these debates just a sideshow? A bunch of intellectuals debating amongst themselves and who gets the one-upmanship and whatever, who wins the debate, with no impact on economic policy? Or are these debates central to economic policy? Are economists really in the driver's seat in terms of what is going to be the economic policy in the future? So, some people view, economic interests are determining policy. Others say it really is the ideas of economists. And Larry, he talks about this a little bit in the introductory chapter, but I think given the amount of space he's devoting to the economic debates themselves, maybe a conclusion about what is the role of economic ideas in the policy outcome, that would be useful. And here, there's some great economists who have speculated this in the past. Of course, John Maynard Keynes famously said, we're all the slaves of some defunct economist, and that, really it's ideas in the long run that rule the world, not vested interests. George Stigler took exactly the opposite view. He said economists exert a minor and scarcely detectable influence on the societies in which they live. And it's deep-seated economic interests that are running the show. And all this debate about ideas, that's just sort of froth. Interestingly, Hayek almost agrees more with Keynes here. Hayek said that ideas are very important. So Hayek wrote, in every country that has moved towards socialism, the phase of the development in which socialism becomes a determining influence on politics has been preceded for many years by a period during which socialist ideals governing the thinking of the more active intellectuals. Experience suggests that once this phase has been reached, it is merely a question of time until the views now held by the intellectuals become the governing force in politics, implying that once intellectuals make up their mind, it's just a matter of time before those become affect economic policy. And then I'd say in between these views is Milton and Rose Friedman. They said the extraordinary force of experience was the major reason for the change in economic policies. Ideas played a significant part, less by persuading the public than by keeping options open, providing alternative policies to adopt when changes were there to be made. Changes in economic and social and economic policy, they wrote, is preceded by a shift in the climate of intellectual opinion, itself generated at least in part by contemporary social, political, and economic circumstances. So they say ideas are important, but not because they're the determining factor, but because they're the things that politicians will turn to when there's a crisis, when there's a need for change, when there's some sort of change in the structure. So this is a great debate in and of itself. What is the role of ideas in affecting policy? That debate should be in this book as well. But at any rate, let me just congratulate Larry on really a tremendous book. I found it fascinating reading. I'm going to be using it next year, so you're guaranteed at least some sales. But I do look forward to a second edition. Thank you very much.
And now we'll hear from Professor Perry Mehrling from Barnard College, Columbia University. And Perry is the author of the definitive biography on Fisher Black, maybe the only biography on Fisher Black, but also the money interest and the public interest. Perry is also intimately involved with the probably one of the biggest movements at the moment that transforming the future of economics at INET, the Institute for New Economic Thinking. And I'll turn it over to Perry.
You forgot to mention my most recent book, The New Lombard Street.
Oh, that's right.
How the Fed Became the Dealer of Last Resort in a bookstore near you.
Yes, he wrote that book too. Yep.
When Paul Krugman painted John Maynard Keynes as a pioneering critic of dominant free market economics, he exaggerated wildly, both about the rigidity of orthodoxy and about the pioneering character of Keynes' critique. So says Larry White in his book, The Clash of Economic Ideas. And speaking as a sometime historian of thought, I'm inclined to agree. Nevertheless, somewhat puzzlingly, although now I understand a little bit more about the choices he made and where they came from, White goes on to organize his book as an account of the Manichaean struggle between advocates of capitalism versus socialism, free markets versus government planning, spontaneous order versus deliberate design, and the Mont Pelerin Society versus the Fabian Society. For him, it's a struggle epitomized by the clash between Hayek and Keynes, and readers should know from up front that White is always rooting for Hayek, and for the ancestry that he constructs for Hayek, back to Karl Menger and Adam Smith. This is a book with a definite point of view, which is why it works, actually. This isn't a criticism, it's an explanation. Indeed, the best that can be said on the other side for Keynes is that he, along with his Fabian fellow travelers, was an unwitting dupe of the real enemy of freedom, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. The worst that can be hinted of Keynes is that he may himself have been one of those enemies of freedom whose skill in wielding political power allowed them to get ahead in a system where political power controls everything. For White, following Hayek, the road to serfdom is a veritable sheet of ice, a slippery slope that can easily sweep the unwitting traveler off his feet and land him in servitude. Luckily, England pulled back from the edge before it was too late, but other countries were not so fortunate. India's experience with central planning is presented as an object lesson to all others who might be so tempted. Germany's miraculous post-war recovery is the counterexample on the other side. The book is organized, as its subtitle announces, and as you've just heard from Larry's introduction, as an account of the great policy debates and experiments of the last 100 years. They are listed in the first sentence of the introduction, and I'll just remind you of these. And I'm quoting now. The adoption of central banking in the United States and elsewhere, command economies during the First World War, communist central planning in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and China. I missed the China part. Fascism in Mussolini's Italy, National Socialism in Hitler's Germany, the New Deal in Roosevelt's United States, the Bretton Woods, international monetary system, and the adoption of Keynesian macroeconomic policies after the Second World War, major nationalizations in post-war Great Britain, the reemergence of free market principles in post-war Germany, Soviet-style 5-year plans in India, the final abandonment of gold in favor of a system of fluctuating exchange rates among unanchored government fiat monies, regulation and deregulation and re-regulation around the globe, the collapse and repudiation of communism in Russia and Eastern Europe, market-led growth policies in East Asian tigers and then in China and India, neoliberal policies promoting the globalization of economic activities. Phew. Let it be stipulated that the book covers a lot of territory. And also that it's a rip-roaring read, actually. I learned, for example, just to pick one that caught my attention, that according to Keynes' biographer Harrod, Keynes' recipe for the young economist was to know his Marshall thoroughly and read his Times every day carefully. That caught me because I always tell my students, the Financial Times, okay, you need to read your Financial Times every day carefully. So I didn't know that I had that in common with Keynes. So I had fun reading this book. But now let me turn to some moments of criticism. My main concern, and I hear this a little bit from Doug too, although I'm going to be sharper, my main concern is the way that essentially every one of the debates and experiments is read through the very same lens. I think this probably works pretty well pedagogically if you're running a course, but as history of thought, it leaves a little bit to be desired. All the debates are viewed essentially as variations on the long-ago socialist calculation debate between Oscar Lange and Ludwig von Mises. Can a planned economy even work, much less outperform a free market economy? That's the question. According to White, Mises was right on that question, and Lange was wrong. But unfortunately, the matter did not end there, and it's been playing out on the world stage ever since. Now, you might think I'd be more sympathetic to this frame, since my own assessment of the Walrasian turn in economics is probably even more negative than White's. He singles out Lange as the origin of the tendency. In my own research, I put the spotlight instead on Jacob Marshak. But leave that aside. The important point is that the Walrasian turn imagined that the economy could be envisioned as a set of simultaneous equations. You all know that, with the market-clearing set of relative prices as the solution. This vision captivated post-war economics, monetarists and Keynesians alike, Friedman and Tobin, and today new classical and new Keynesian alike as well. It's the dominant view. White doesn't like it, for Hayekian reasons, essentially, having to do with information and time. As for me, I don't like it either, but for Frank Hahn reasons, which is to say it has no place in it for money. But either way, the important historical fact is that this way of thinking about economics rose to become dominant, pushing White's favored Austrian tradition into the background, and also my own favored money view tradition, as I like to call it, into the background. So we're both I don't know, heretics of some kind. Maybe from different angles, although I'm going to talk about some similarities. When I agreed to discuss this book, I guess I got an email about it, I imagined that we might have our own clash of ideas on the subject of money, where Larry is an advocate of free banking, including competitive note issue. I imagined I would ask him, whether he views the shadow banking system as an example of competitive note issue. I'll ask him that. Unfortunately, he doesn't say very much about money in the book. There are only 2 money chapters to my way of understanding, which is the one on Bretton Woods that he mentioned and the one on post-war inflation about Keynes and then about Friedman. Nevertheless, it's pretty clear that he views central banking through the same lens as everything else. It's just another example of the government stepping in to do what free markets do better. In this case, the bankers' clearinghouses that predated modern central banks. I beg to differ. I align myself with Bagehot, who famously stated that money will not manage itself and Lombard Street has a great deal of money to manage. More generally, I align myself with the larger tradition of British central banking thought, of which Bagehot was a part, including Ralph Hawtrey, big fan of Ralph Hawtrey, Charles Goodhart, and I would even say John Maynard Keynes in that tradition. Like all central bankers, Keynes was trying to find ways to keep an inherently unstable system from blowing apart, not just domestically, but also internationally. The international role of the pound was in decline throughout Keynes's life, but very much present as the intellectual context for his thinking and writing. This is a very different frame for understanding Keynes than the one offered by White, but also, I hasten to add, very different than the one offered by Krugman that I started with, which is also a caricature, perhaps worse. Krugman serves White, so let's talk about Krugman. Krugman serves White in this book as a kind of stalking horse, probably in hope that Krugman will attack the book on his blog, and so sell more copies. I guess I have that right. Yep. For my purposes, Krugman is interesting for a different reason, as a concrete example of how different American Keynesianism, that is Krugmanian Keynesianism, was from the economics of Keynes. The Keynesian economics that White explains in Chapter 5 is really the economics of Krugman more than it is the economics of Keynes. He traces it correctly back to Samuelson and even farther to Alvin Hansen, but he sees Hansen as nothing more than a popularizer of Keynes. That's a standard view, by the way, but as someone who's written a biography of Hansen, I have to take issue with this account, and since I have the stage, I'm going to correct that story. Maybe I make things worse for Hansen by saying so, but I must insist that Hansen be understood fundamentally as an American institutionalist, very much akin to those who made Roosevelt's New Deal. For White, that makes things worse because he sees the American institutionalists, Ely, Commons, and others, as successors to the German historical school, the Marx-influenced socialists of the chair who supported Hitler and fascism. Indeed, for White, as for Hayek, the important thing about Hitler's National Socialism is that it was socialism. Behind Hitler, and Mussolini too, is Lenin. So for him, the American institutionalists are, like the British Fabian Society, tainted by the intellectual company they keep. Here again, I must beg to differ. The American institutionalists were just as much rejecting Marx and the classical economics tradition as they were rejecting Marshall and the neoclassical economics tradition. For better or worse, they saw these theories as products of class-ridden, tired old Europe, not applicable to the brave new world. I shouldn't say brave new world, to the new world, to America. For them, for these American institutionalists, optimistic American institutionalists, government was not the agent of the oppressive king or the ruling class, but rather the collectivity of town fathers gathering together to solve common problems. Europeans, Keynes and Hayek equally, typically found it difficult to understand what these Americans were up to, and they tended to treat them as intellectual inferiors, look down on them. But they were up to something, and it wasn't fascism or socialism, it was democratic self-government. So I've already indicated that I traced one side of my own ancestry to the tradition of British central banking. Let's call that my father's side. I traced the other side to American institutionalism. Call that my mother's side. So here's two sides in which we might have a further clash of ideas. My concern, I submit to you, is that like our missed clash about money, this one is also more obscured than illuminated by viewing it through the narrow lens of the socialist calculation debate, much less the emotionally charged lens of enemies versus defenders of freedom. I think everyone up here is a defender of freedom. I think that's what economics is mostly about. We're just looking for the best way to go about it. Thank you.
Okay, Larry.
Well, both authors remarked on the fact that the book is not chronological in the usual sense of going economic thinker by economic thinker, starting as early as you want to start and moving toward the present. I probably should have mentioned in my remarks that there was another influence on that, which was my graduate instructor in history of economic thought was Thomas Sowell. And Sowell organized things in what I regarded as the sort of rigorous way, which was topic by topic. So we had a week on rent theory where we read the 5 classic pieces on rent theory, and then a week on returns to scale, and a week on money and prices, and so on. And I always thought that was better than sort of the lazy man's way of teaching it. Here's what Smith said, here's what Ricardo said, here's what Marx said. Doug says there's not quite enough economic history. Well, for a history of economic thought book, there's a lot of economic history. I'm sure there could always be more. The book could always be longer. I'm particularly mindful that I didn't have a chapter on antitrust and the debate over antitrust, which was important. I didn't have a chapter on the debate over the Federal Reserve Act, but I've written about that elsewhere. And I certainly didn't have anything about debate over banking regulation, which of course is very much on the front burner today. So should there be a second edition, those would be strong candidates. Perry suggested that I was sort of viewing all the other debates through the lenses of the socialist calculation debate. And I'll have to go back and see whether that's true, because I certainly didn't mean to do that. Certainly not the macro chapters. And I don't think even the micro chapters. I mean, I think the questions about sort of piecemeal intervention are different than the questions about can you arrange the entire economy from one central committee. I, of course, like what he had to say about the problems with Walrasian theory and the exclusion of money from that way of thinking about the economy. When he mentioned Walter Bagehot, I really perked up because I'm a Bagehot man myself, and my favorite parts of Lombard Street are where Bagehot says, well, the ideal system is the system that would have grown up if there hadn't been any government interference. You just have to look to Scotland to see what that would look like. There's competition among many banks of more or less equal size, keeping their own reserves, not relying on the government. But we in England have evolved this one reserve system where the Bank of England holds all the reserves because we've placed crippling legal restrictions on all the other banks. And of course, there was a history of legal restrictions on every bank other than the Bank of England to maintain the Bank of England's monopoly powers. So I didn't really put Bagehot into the book because I didn't have a chapter on banking regulation, but he would certainly play an important role in such a chapter. And finally, on the institutionalists, I wasn't trying to insinuate that the institutionalists were Marxists in any sense. I tried to distinguish in the book among different kinds of socialism. And in fact, in the first chapter, I say there are as many kinds of socialism as there are kinds of capitalism. Right? So there's Marxian socialism, but there's also nationalistic socialism, and there's Bismarckian socialism. And that was the socialism of the German historical school. So sort of more for the interests of the median voter than for the proletariat. But maybe I need to make those distinctions clear and issue more disclaimers about what I'm not trying to do in the book. But thank you both very much for your very helpful comments.
Okay, we can open it up now for questions, and I'll acknowledge, but you direct your question at the member. Yeah, Todd, go ahead.
Well, Larry, I'll ask Doug's question and give us the outline of what the conclusion will look like. What do we take away from all this?
Okay, so as I think Perry mentioned, I do, or maybe Doug, I guess Doug mentioned this. In either the introduction or the first chapter, I say there are different points of view as to whether economic ideas matter. And that's sort of one of the themes of the book, although I don't come back and draw it out explicitly. But I mean, my view is that is to agree with Hayek and Keynes most of the time, that economic ideas are very powerful, and I give lots of examples where it's hard to understand the economic reform that took place without understanding how it was previously an idea hatched by an intellectual. So the policies adopted in the New Deal it came from Tugwell and the people who influenced Tugwell and the other people who thought like Tugwell in the Brain Trust. It's hard to see that there was any vested interest, although once the cartels of the NRA were created, of course, vested interests took control of them. But I'm not aware of them sort of being lobbied for that purpose. I mean, I could be wrong about that. But there are some other cases where a theory is already around and it gets adopted by policymakers because it conveniently rationalizes what they want to do anyway. And so the rationale for deficit spending was adopted by policymakers who, out of necessity really, in the Great Depression were already running deficits. Rather than with Stigler, I associate this view that interests rule everything with Pareto. That's who I cite early on in the book. Right? So the idea is policymakers have lots of thinkers they could appeal to for intellectual cover. And once they decide what the policy is, then the intellectuals scramble to come up with the right view so that they can be favored by the policymakers. That was Pareto's view of the way things worked. And he tried to illustrate that by reference to international trade policy, at least the way it had worked in Italy. So I'm as cynical as the next person, I think, although I'm continually surprised when I read the news. It just that I could have been not cynical enough. But I think the intellectual, I mean, the story I tell in the book gives us lots of examples where ideas do matter. So I guess that's the sort of thing I would talk about in a concluding chapter. Here's your scorecard. So that's the objective of the book, to make that point. As Perry says, it certainly does have a point of view, but well, on Tyler's blog, when he mentioned the book, one of the commenters raised a very good question, which was, well, so is this a book to tell us who was right and who was wrong? Or was this, to give a more neutral account of the debate? And I like to think it's somewhere in between. I don't claim to be neutral, but I try to be respectful to the side that stands for central planning, for intervention, for other policies that I don't think have worked out well.
John?
Larry, I'd like to hear your take. I mean, like the panelists, I do think it's interesting you don't talk a lot about China.
Mm-hmm.
Relative, and you have such a big role played here. Clearly, one of the issues where it comes up, the role of intellectual versus the role of pragmatism, would be say contrasting kind of the thought with Chinese, something like that. What's your take?
Well, I didn't write a chapter about China because I don't know anything about China. So I would have had to start even more from scratch than I did in the other chapters. I mean, I learned a lot writing the book, as I had to find out a lot of things I didn't know, a lot of names and details and events, and then try to make a coherent narrative out of it. But I'd be completely starting from zero if I were to write about China. If you can point me in the right direction of somebody who can explain what brought about Chinese policy reforms, that would be very interesting, because I'd like to know how it fits into this simple question of were there interests at work or ideas at work, or what combination of the two.
Maybe we can, John, maybe we could push that question a little bit and relate it to Doug's characterization of the Friedmans, because experience seems to be a very important part of that feedback, right? So there was a Friedman who went to China and said, privatize, privatize, privatize. That's where that's from. But that wasn't what the movement was that happened in China. It was a very pragmatic thing. And then there's an institutional shift. And I wonder if, what role, like if you could play out some more, maybe that difference in your comments between the Friedmans and Hayek and Keynes on the one hand and Stigler, say, for example, on the other. I'm directing that, I guess, back at you about explaining that, maybe even thinking about it in terms of your own work on free trade and stuff.
So I refer people to Ann Kruger's presidential address to the American Economic Association, published, I think, in the AER 1997. It was called Trade and Development, How We Learn. And what it's about, it's a great essay. It's about the sea change in the view of mainstream professional economists on the view of trade policy and economic development from the 50s and 60s, when they advocated import substitution, forced industrialization, if you will, towards a much more freer trade, export promotion policy stance. And she, once again, goes through ideas, experience, and I think the message is very much similar to the Friedmans. One point she makes in her address is that economists in the 50s and 60s had the wrong stylized facts. And if you start out with the wrong stylized facts and you build models around them to explain them, and this provides a, quote, intellectual justification for some sort of thing, then you're sort of getting on the wrong track. And you took the experience of certain East Asian countries where they didn't have problems when they liberalized. They didn't have problems when they promoted exports. In fact, they did a lot better. That experience provided feedback that got people thinking, well, maybe we're off on the wrong track. So for, another example of that is the view that in the 50s and 60s that monetary policy wasn't all that important. Well, if the stylized fact that comes out of the 30s is that monetary policy doesn't work very well, and so you build that into your underlying assumptions, then you can go for 2 decades until a Friedman comes along and says, hey, wait, money's central here, and in fact, your stylized fact about the 30s is wrong. Money's central to what's going on. So it's funny how these little stylized facts get us onto the wrong track sometimes and divert us from what actually is going on until someone says, hey, wait a second, the economic history here is different.
Maybe I'll echo. I guess I see the lines of causation both directions. In the sense that what the work that I've done has mostly been writing intellectual biographies, as a matter of fact. And so what I'm quite interested in is the way people's ideas are shaped by their life experiences, by how they're growing up. And they always have some kind of inherited set of ideas from their teachers or what they were reading or what they were taught in class and so forth. But then the world does things. And so they're viewing the world through a lens that isn't the right lens. It distorts it, and then they have to change. They have to evolve and invent new stuff. This is true of individuals, but I think it's actually true of the profession too. So it goes both ways. There's a feedback loop. Ideas cause history, but history causes ideas. Both ways.
Further questions? You have a question? Yep. You're going to use the mic. Yeah. Okay.
So one of the clashes throughout history, I think, has been over fringe monetary theories, particularly going back to the Civil War. You have the Greenbackers, and you have, William Jennings Bryan over gold and silver, and I think the guy's name was Jezebel, who influenced Keynes a little bit in his monetary theory. Talked about, the depreciating the value of money. So, but it kind of worked, into his theory in a more toned down way. So I don't think these ideas have really occupied front and center economic debates as much, but they've actually influenced public policy, such as Major Douglas and the Canadian Central Bank. And I think that this debate is still going on. Dennis Kucinich has a bill, which is basically a greenbacker bill. It would hand over the keys of the printing press to Nancy Pelosi. So I don't see a lot of debate on this per se, but we do have INET, which is proposing some newer ideas or different, not necessarily a social credit theory or anything per se, but both historically and present, I'd be interested in the panel's thoughts on what's normally considered more fringe monetary theory.
Okay. Well, as a fringe monetary theorist myself, but of a non-inflationist sort, I'm all for widening the scope of institutional assumptions that we question in discussing monetary arrangements. In the book, in the chapter that starts with Bretton Woods goes back to the gold standard and then talks about the dissenters from the gold standard, like William Jennings Bryan, and what they were on about. And the chapter about that starts with Friedman talks about the problem of inflation. I don't talk about Major Douglas or some of the other, or Silvio Giselle. And I'm not sure he had much influence on Keynes. I think Keynes was just citing him in order to be provocative, trying to shake people out of their dogmatic slumbers, as he put it. But I think in the wake of the financial crisis, there is an opportunity to reconsider these kinds of questions, and I think there is some movement in that direction.
Perry, do you want to take that?
Used to be said of me that I was a specialist in monetary cranks. And yeah, Fisher Black is thought to have had a very strange theory of money, it's not such a strange theory of money, actually. If you know some history of monetary theory, and in particular, there are these basically two traditions: the currency school tradition and the banking school tradition. You could add a third one, the free banking tradition, which I sort of see as the childhood of banking school tradition, so I sort of lump them together. But if you want to separate them out, and I think it's not possible to be a good monetary economist if you are only in one of these camps, frankly. That the problems the world throws up change over time. And so whether the problem is too much discipline or too much elasticity, it's a matter of whether you should be a banking school person or a currency school person. I teach money in banking. Actually, that's my main class. I don't teach history of thought, as a matter of fact. I use history of economics to learn about banking. But these fringe ideas, I think it's very important to ask why they're coming up. Where they come from, why people feel the need to generate these fringe ideas. The suspicion of banking, the anxiety about banking, about the ability of banks to create things, something out of nothing, okay, is an anxiety. And who controls that? Who has that power? Should the government be trusted with that power? Or should in fact, J.P. Morgan be trusted with that power? Maybe nobody should be trusted with that power, but that's sort of how banks are. And so there's a lot of anxiety about that. And I would like to put a pitch right here for having more of I see this as a teaching moment in history right now in the United States in this regard, that we do not have a very high-level dialogue in the United States about money and banking. And this all goes back to the origins of the Fed. I wish you would put a chapter, so let me give a plug. Put a chapter for the origins of the Fed. And here's my story about this. There are three bogeymen and then I'll stop. There are three bogeymen which have been behind the scenes in American political discussion about money since the very beginning. One is big government. We don't want to hand over the central bank to big government. The other one is big finance. We don't want to hand it over to J.P. Morgan. And the other is the big wide world, okay? We don't really want to be involved with other countries. We want to have our own monetary system. And, well, World War I basically meant that we handed it over to big government. So we kind of got used to that, running our whole economy, running our whole monetary system on treasury bills. That's not the way it was supposed to be, the Fed. The Fed was supposed to be discounting short-term commercial paper. That was the whole idea. But it didn't. It wound up funding the government. But we got used to that because it seemed the exigencies of war. What we did not get used to is what it's become now, which is big finance and the big wide world. And nobody can talk about it because the Federal Reserve Act doesn't actually allow that. And yet it's doing it, and it's evolved in 100 years. But it's very difficult for Ben Bernanke or anybody else. So that's what I do. I'm a professor. I don't have to be, I don't work for the Fed. So I think there's a teaching moment. And that's why I wrote that book and why I continue to accept invitations to things like this.
Karen?
Really love your approach. I think the students would probably find it fascinating, but I want to say a quick word in defense of the chronological approach.
Okay. Here, here.
As someone who taught history of economic thought probably 30 years, from a chronological perspective, I would just like to argue that you can't teach it as dryly, well, somebody said this and somebody said that. I mean, it's not just one damn thing after another. But whatever issues are being discussed in any era are debates that are based on the historical circumstances, and they're almost never purely blackboard exercises. I mean, I'm thinking of the scholastic debates over just price. That wasn't just some kind of an abstract problem. It was a problem of wondering what to make of market pricing, and that was becoming more and more evident, and how to deal with the volatility of it. In mercantilist era, those were debates over what the proper interest rate should be, and they were debates based on understanding of what the Dutch were doing and what England's role in the general economy. So let me just put it this way. A good teacher always brings these debates into it.
Okay, good. Well, I think, who said it before, who else, and who drew on that earlier thinker, that's in my book too. I think a good teacher always talks about that. But it just seems to be sometimes awkward to say, here's what Adam Smith had to say about prices, here's what he had to say about monopoly, here's what he had to say about money, here's what he had to say about trade, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And now we'll move on to Ricardo. And then we have to remember when we read what Ricardo said about price, how that related to what Smith said about price. It just seems for some purposes, especially for my purpose, I only want to talk about the policy relevant parts of economics, to do it topic by topic. And then I can skip those thinkers who didn't treat particular topics.
I'm going to be teaching out of the book in the fall, both at the graduate level and at the undergraduate level. And at the graduate level, it will be a book alongside of Blau's book, and then journal articles and stuff. And then at the undergraduate level, it's actually just going to serve as the basis in an honors course for a discussion about multiple perspectives in political economy. But one of the things that I decided after I looked at Larry's book and decided I was going to teach from it is that the first thing that I'm going to make both classes read is actually an article by John Stuart Mill from 1848 called The Claims of Labor, in which he makes this play between the distinction between ideas and events, and whether or not ideas are disembodied from events, or can events be separated from the ideas that capture them. And what Mill argues in that essay is that if it's just one or the other, it's a very transitory moment. Like an event that doesn't have any ideas that explain it just sort of disappears. And if ideas are floating and they don't have any circumstances that bring them to be important, they go away. But when ideas and circumstances get together, that's when, the fire in men's minds are lit, right? Or women's minds, right? So I'm being correct here. And so it's like kind of picking up on that Mill point, I think, to then lay the groundwork for then the discussion. And so I like to think about the way that Larry does this in this book as related to that issue. Like, why is it that people get so passionate over technical questions, right? There's some big issue that's lurking in the back of their heads that gets them really worked up about, whether or not you think, deflation or inflation, or, which is going to destroy the economy, right? There's some fate that's at stake here. And that's what I want to sort of communicate, at least, or try to get to the students. Not necessarily which side is right or wrong. I have my own view, but I don't really care if the students buy that position. What I care is that they want to join that conversation and they think of it as important. I mean, I personally, it's like in your book, one of the reasons, and you see the relationship between Against the Tide and in Larry's book in that sense, because in both cases, it's a history of this dispute over very technical issues, but they have big implications about the way you do it. And so you march through all the different arguments. and yet show, okay, well, when it comes down, how's it going to end up by working out? So I think that's a very useful way to teach this kind of material, as opposed to the Blaug way, right, which is rational reconstruction in a large part. And so it's kind of an interesting dialogue. Other questions? Yes? Another historian of thought and an economic historian.
So continuing on with sort of do economic ideas as policy issues. I haven't read the book, and as depicted, it seems sort of this is largely sort of clashed within a group, among economists and so on. And I'm wondering if you could say more about the issue of the credibility and expertise of economists among the general public at large, which often surfaces, and what role that plays in allowing ideas. For example, what are we to make of Irving Fisher's episode? Not that he ended up having to lose his sister or whatever. What does that imply about how his ideas as such would play out? So I wonder if anybody in the panel could say more about issues of expertise, credibility of the economics profession among policymakers.
Well, I certainly didn't mean to suggest that we don't need to read Fisher's books because he lost money in the stock market. I mean, quite the contrary. When I teach graduate macro, the first half is all Irving Fisher practically. Some of my students here can testify. And it's an interesting question to ask, how seriously have economists been taken over the years? And I mean, the Wealth of Nations had a pretty big impact, I think, in Parliament, not right away, but by the time of the Corn Law debate. I mean, I think what the reason economists who deserve respect deserve it is not their own personal biography, but whether the ideas prove useful to other thinkers, whether they're fruitful ideas, whether they help explain things that happen in the world. So I think we can sort of judge that apart from the biographical stories. I threw those in to make it more interesting, to know something about the people, but it's not as personality driven as, say, the worldly philosophers is. I'm not that concerned. I'm more concerned with the ideas than with the particular people. I mean, does that get at your question? I feel like I'm not quite addressing it.
Part of what issue has been raised is does the economic profession deserve culpability for the recent financial crisis?
Okay. Well, I think in some respects it does. I mean, I think that bad monetary policy was part of the cause, and I think that the bad monetary policy was driven by bad ideas about what monetary policy ought to do. So in that respect, yeah. Now, when it comes to bad banking regulation, there maybe interests played a bigger role than sort of bad theoretical ideas. I'm not sure. I'd have to look into that more closely, but that would be my sort of prior.
Maybe I can. I basically agree with all of that, but let me add another dimension to it. I think it's important to remember that the notion that economics is a policy science is relatively recent. This is really a 20th century or even post-World War II kind of phenomenon where there are Council of Economic Advisors advising the king and all, the prince, the president, whatever. This is, that's certainly not what Adam Smith was really doing. And the earlier economists, there was no profession of being an economist. So people were writing these books, and they were writing them because they were trying to figure out the world they were living in, trying to say, well, what's that all about? So I come back to this question about teaching. When I did teach history of thought, I actually just taught a whole course in Smith, Marx, and Keynes. That was it, only in the original. And it was a course about, Smith was about the commercial revolution. And we read Brodel, and it was like, markets, what's all that about? They seem to have a logic that's larger than any individual market, and that's very confusing to people, and try to understand that. So the commercial revolution. And Marx says, what's that about? That's about the industrial revolution. That's about these new ways of organizing life that are changing ourselves. It's still about the commercial revolution, you know, it's still there, but now there's a new thing. And then Keynes was about the managerial revolution, large corporations and large government, and what's all that about? So it's, I think that economists just even have a great role to play in society, just helping people like understand the world they're living in, that and make some sense of it. Not just as, we shouldn't be valued just because we can like say, well, the right Fed funds rate right now is 3.7, you know. I don't know, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but that's not what most people are concerned about. They're concerned about whether finance is out of whack. What do we have to say about that?
We have time for one more question. Yes?
So there's some speculation about what might be in the second edition. Well, certainly you could speculate a little bit more about what would be in the third or the fourth or the 10th or the 20th. And so it's the great policy debates and experiments of the last 200 years. Does the book need to be twice as long? Does it need to be like fill up an entire library of volumes, or is it just the same debate rehashed over and over again? And we're at Keynes versus Hayek round 50, and the book only needs to be like a few more pages long.
Well, I try to detail the ways in which theories have become more sophisticated over the years. All right, so for example, in the chapter on public goods, I say, well, you can kind of read public goods theory into Adam Smith, but he wasn't nearly as precise about it as we can be today. I mean, he gave examples that aren't very good examples of public goods, for example. He had sort of the idea that there were things that would be of benefit to everybody, but in nobody's interest. Nobody could recoup the costs of providing them privately, but sort of didn't really spell out the conditions that we can now spell out. So I think and similarly in the chapter on trade, I talk about how the infant industry argument has gotten more sophisticated over the years. So it gets a little bit longer the longer we go forward. It doesn't double in length, right? It's some fraction of that because the advances are not completely throwing out the old theory and putting in a new theory. They're sort of marginal improvements or in some kind marginal degradation of the original theory. So I think it asymptotically approaches a finite length book, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, that was his question, wasn't it?
All right. Well, thank you very much, Larry and Perry and Doug. And thank you very much for coming. We have a reception outside. You're all welcome to join. And please help me thank these panelists.